So, part one, we were talking about how a federal job is a competitive process and the uses of tests, and it can't just be a political acquaintance that gets people a federal job these days. So, let's look at some regulatory commissions. So, this idea of regulatory commissions, it kind of started in the late 1800s, but it really became a big part of America after the Great Depression. So we don't have as nearly as many until after the Great Depression. Some of the problems that were caused by the Great Depression, they were kind of reactionary, and some were as the political sentiment changed in America. So um, the commissions are and were structured with um, the idea of independence from the president. So they wanted to be independent. They wanted them to be independent where they could not be completely controlled by the president. Reasons for this: most of these regulatory commissions directly deal with the economy. And when Congress set them up, they wanted them to be free of political influences. So it could just be a, commission that regulated parts of the economy, but wouldn't be bought and sold by the politicians. At least that's the idea. Um, the boards are appointed by the president. So people that serve on the board. Typically, there are 5 to 7 members that run the regulatory commission. Um, so the president selects who he wants to be appointed. They must go through confirmation by the Senate, just like a federal judge or even a Supreme Court justice would do. Their terms are staggered. So of the 5 to 7 people in the commission, um, they do have staggered terms, and then their terms are longer. They're not like 1 or 2 years. They're typically more like a 6 to 8 year terms, and because of that, presidents don't change them as much. So and it depends on what regulatory commission we're talking about, how long the term is. They can be shorter. They can be 4 years, but it also the when Congress created these regulatory commissions, they basically gave them power to administer the programs for which they were created. For example, the FCC. It can regulate all types of communication. The SEC can regulate all types of investments on Wall Street. So typically when you would have corruption or something like this, you could have Congress call some of these leaders of these different corporations or businesses in and question them and possibly, prosecute them for not following certain laws. But in this case, you have a commission do it. It's not connected to politicians, and it kind of plays that like independent role. Now, these regulatory commissions have been a topic of great debate. Um, the SEC, the purpose of them is to ensure that there is full and fair disclosure. So many of the investors that lost a lot of money in the Great Depression, um, there was a lot of insider trading. In addition to that, um, there was a lot of buying on the margin. So the SEC was created after, I shouldn't say after the Great Depression because it was really created during the Depression, to basically protect the investor, but also to protect the broker and to make sure that the stock market didn't fall apart like that. Most of these regulatory commissions, some of their main goals, or what we call government goals, are to ensure competition, protect consumers, um, enact industrial safety. So when we look at these big overall goals of protection and helping with safety and competition, some people argue that these regulatory commissions are actually a hindrance to free enterprise, which is true, they are. Some argue that they have so much power as a regulatory commission and they're not connected to the democratic system, meaning they're not elected by anybody. No one elected these regulatory commissions, but they have the power to take away license. They have the power to shut down businesses, but they're not elected by the people. Um, also, because many times Congress gives them very blanket statements, they kind of have the power to carry it out however they see fit. Well, that can also kind of be something that people view as them being, I want to call it partisan, but basically biased in one way. Also, we find in these regulatory commissions a lot of things that are unnecessarily complex. So think of like government red tape. Many people point to things like regulatory commissions as an argument for saying there is too much government red tape, and no matter how much regulations you put, um, it continues to be an inefficient government. The other question that we have to ask is, can these agencies remain free from special interest groups' power? A lot of special interest groups have power. Um, they have power of the pocketbook, they have power of influence, and it seems like some of these agencies that are there for protection are also very influenced by the people they're supposed to be protecting. And that's really one of the bigger arguments against regulations. Many people see a need for regulation, but where we see a big partisan difference is how much regulation. So, how far do we go with regulation before we say it's too much? How much do we allow businesses to have power and control and support new businesses and allow the free enterprise system to work? The whole thing of ensuring competition. The idea of free enterprise is to expand and to do better and to make more money and to make a better product and just continue. That's the principle of free enterprise and capitalism. But if there's a regulatory government commission double checking to make sure that everybody gets a fair game, um, some people say that that's really not true free enterprise. So there's a lot of different opinions on regulatory commissions. Examples of regulatory commission like the FCC or the communications, it could be a radio station. The real big one is the um, internet, obviously. So government corporations. This is our final part of the third here. They're set up by Congress. Many of them are created for a particular reason, for a particular um, issue. Um, these are there's not near as many government corporations as there are independent agencies. In fact, to put a government corporation under agencies is actually not entirely correct. A government corporation is kind of an oddball because they not only are under the executive branch, but they're actually also under the legislative branch. So they're under the president and they're under Congress. Examples being Amtrak, the TVA, the U.S. Postal Service. They are businesses or business-like corporations, but they are different in that they are financed by public funds. So they do produce an income, but that income is put back into the agency's programs. Um, if one of the things that's been argued that even though, like, so we don't think of the government producing an income, but even though these government corporations do produce an income, even if it's put back into the agency programs, sometimes that can really balloon up the top like managers of that government corporation. For example, maybe the head of Amtrak the CEO might make more money the more income it makes. Well, if it's financed through the public funds, some people feel like that's not really democratic and that's not really what they want as far as a government corporation. Now, the Postal Service being kind of an exception and something that's evolved over the years. The TVA and Amtrak were both influenced by the late 1800s and the 1930s, where we see a huge increase in governmental bureaucracy. The bureaucracy expanded so much in a 50-year period It's actually quite amazing. Some people really do believe that they are not democratic or held accountable by the people. Who ensures that the U.S. Postal Service is using the financed public funds in the right way? Who is holding the U.S. Postal Service accountable? And if they are receiving federal funds, um, why do they keep raising stamp prices? That's been a really big argument for that. If we look at the government versus private corporations, um, when a government corporation produces income, it has to go back into the agency's programs. If we look at private corporations, um, it most of the time goes back into the business. It allows the business to expand where the government corporations are a little more restricted. Um, office People that work in these government corporations are public employees, where in a private corporation they're not government workers at all. um, the investor or the directors are chosen by the top officers choose the top officers in a private corporation, and the president will select the officers of the corporation with Senate approval. So the head of the U.S. Postal Service is actually selected by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And then the real big difference is how they're financed. One's financed through public funds, the other one through private investors, the government holding the stock. And that's all of notes 6.3.